unmute myself here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the OMAFRA Controlled Environment Agriculture webinar series. My name is Fadi Al-Daoud. I'm the Greenhouse Vegetable Specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. My co-host today is Andrew Wylie. He is the Acting Greenhouse Vegetable Integrated Pest Management Specialist, while Karen McCreary is off on mat leave. Most of you that have joined us for this webinar series know that it's a monthly webinar series that we've been holding since January. You can get more information about past webinars that we've had on our Greenhouse Vegetable blog, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well and get some information there. This webinar is being recorded, and I'll pass on the recording to registrants after the fact. And before we start with our speaker today, I'd like to get to know the audience as I usually do. I'll start the poll here so everybody can let us know where you're from and what you grow, and then we'll have a good idea of who's with us. Launch the poll. So it'd be great if you could just take a few seconds here to answer these questions. First one would be, what is your occupation, whether you're a producer, researcher, industry folks. Also what you grow, whether you're a greenhouse vegetable producer, cannabis, flower producer. And it'd be great to know where you're located, whether you're in Ontario, outside of Ontario, in another country, because we do have some international participation as well. I'll give people a few more seconds here. Okay, great. So let's share the results so everybody can see what we got. Good to see most of our attendees are producers, some industry folk, a couple of government officials, and other folks joining us as well. Most of the people grow either vegetables or flowers in greenhouses. Some vertical farmers are here, as well as cannabis producers, which is great. And most of the folks are in Ontario. Great. Outside of Ontario, I know a number of people tune in from BC, and some friends from the US and Asia as well. So that's great. All right, let's get right to our speaker. He is OMAFRA's very own Dr. Jason Deveau. Jason is application and technology specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and I will let him take it from here. Thanks for joining us today, Jason.
Thanks to Fadi and Andrew for having me. And I really like the way you opened the talk by asking, where's everybody from and what do they grow? Because it's going to play a real role in what I'm hoping to discuss today. So let me confirm that you're seeing my title screen.
Yeah, that's good.
Brilliant. Okay. After all this time doing so many of these presentations, you can't believe how often I still manage to mess that up. Okay, so today's talk is about spraying in closed environments, and I confess when I was asked to do this, I thought it would be remedial, and feel free to tune out right away if you're insulted, but it's not. What I appreciate about, even after 12 years in this position, is that occasionally I come across something that forces me to reevaluate what I think I know. So we're going to talk about all the different things that you need to be concerned with if you're applying products in a greenhouse through a spray type medium. And just a quick shout out to Louis Dam, who years ago when I started in this position, Louis was kind enough to let me shadow him on some of his talks. And there's a lot this man knows about spraying in greenhouses. And it was probably the beginning of my education in abandoning some foundational notions about spraying. He made me think differently about a few things. So some of the content in here is inspired by a few things I've heard Louis say. Now, who am I? I used to be a plant cell electrophysiologist, which means I did a lot at the cellular level in biology, and I was chained to a desk in the bottom of the University of Guelph for too many years. And I tell you that because my role was looking at very, very small things, which tends to lend itself to studying how spray droplets move. But I want you to be aware of the fact that I didn't have a background in agriculture. That let me look at things a little fresher than maybe somebody that did. So while it was a terrifying first year, I think it served me well in the end. I've been in the role since 2008. And in that time, I've developed some resources that I think would be valuable for you. Certainly, I'm proud of them. Sprayers 101 is a non-for-profit resource on all things spraying. And if you're not aware of it, I invite you to explore it. I'll plug it again at the end. Recently, with some colleagues, I wrote a textbook, Foundational Information About Spraying. It is about air blast predominantly, but it's entirely valid for your group, for you, because it discusses how droplets move and how to get them basically from A to B. And it's very visual and easy to understand, and it's free. So it may be worth your time. And just because it's fun to keep things fun, with my colleague Tom Wolf out west, we've also done a series of educational videos about spraying called Exploding Sprayer Myths, which should assure you that there's not much we won't do or subject ourselves to entertain and educate. So this talk is going to be all about context, and this is where I had my mind changed. This is kind of my world 75% of the time. A lot of my focus is air blast sprayers for specialty crops. And that's a loosey-goosey term. I'm sure you all feel you grow specialty crops, but I'm talking about three-dimensional, generally fruit and berry crops that are planted on rows outside. And part of what I think I bring to this position that's different is that I'm forced to deal with all these pieces of equipment. These are all technically air blast sprayers. And it's mind-boggling how many designs there are. And they're all designed to do some things very well and some things they don't do terribly well. And all this to say, if I were to just give blanket advice about spraying, it would be wrong in half of these situations. Something that's absolutely correct for the sprayer in the top left was fundamentally wrong for, say, the sprayer in the bottom right. And it means you have to be aware of where you're getting your sprayer information from. And as I say, that I thought I understood that until I started looking at your crops. So I built this table, and I'm going to write an article about this as well. Here are some variables, some things that you may have to pay attention to when you're spraying. The carrier volume that you use, or how much water, the size of the droplet you're producing, the shape of the canopy you're trying to spray, and by shape, I mean its depth, its size. Understanding the basis for how you're determining how much product is required. Maybe a growth regulator, maybe a biorational product, maybe a fungicide, an insecticide, I don't know. But I think we're all familiar with how labels can sometimes let us down in volumetric crops. The distance from the nozzle to the target, it matters. Operator exposure, we have to keep the applicators safe, of course, and concerns about drift. And just to give you a sense of how big this world is, I didn't even try to include information on aerial applications. Technically, I could have added a whole other column. This is where a lot of your information comes from, and that's field and vegetable crops. They seem to have the most experts, have a ton of cash, which means a lot of agrochemical companies cater to them, which means a lot of agri equipment companies that build sprayers cater to them. And a lot of specialists flock to this. And they tend to produce most of our sprayer information. In fact, you throw a rock, you're going to find information on spraying herbicides from a horizontal boom. But here's their world. They use low to moderate carrier volumes. That's a bit loose, but I won't bother drilling down. Just recognize they tend to like to get away with as little water as possible. Their droplet sizes are medium to ultra coarse, which means they have big concerns about drift and keeping spray on target. Their canopy shapes, not to diminish the difficulty in spraying, are pretty easy. If you can't get a droplet to go 50 centimeters to land in a crop that's a foot deep, and I know there are exceptions, that's just kind of the level of detail that they're at. Their basis for input rates, their labels, well, it's built for them. It's based on planted area. The distance from nozzle to target, as I said, they're quite close. The potential for operator exposure is pretty low, even if they're not in a closed filtered cab. They're way out on the other side of the boom outside. But they have a lot of concerns for drift, particularly, again, because herbicides tend to lead this conversation. Now, as I mentioned, in the world I spend most of my time in, apple trees, grapes, berries, we have a different view. We use really high volumes, technically. Our droplet size is very, very small, or small to medium. Our crops don't hug the ground like a blanket. They stick up like a picket fence. Our basis for input rates, we won't get into it, but quite often, not the best way to look at rates. Planted area doesn't make a lot of sense if you're spraying big three-dimensional canopies on variable row spacing. The distance from the target, well, how far is that top nozzle from the top of a 30-foot tree? Pretty far. And the potential for operator exposure, generally we're in a closed cab, but not always. And our concern for drift is only medium because nobody sprays herbicides from air blast. But your world is really diverse. Your carrier volumes can be phenomenally low from misters and foggers to quite high for drench applications. Your droplet size can be the finest that we register, 10, 20 microns fog, all the way up to medium, or if I were to push a bit, I'm sure I could find coarse droplets too. Your canopy shape, tremendously diverse. Maybe you're spraying container crops or vertical crops or even stacked crops. It could be anything. The basis for input rates, I've heard the complaints, believe me. Sometimes they're volumes of the greenhouse. Sometimes they're the planted area of the crop. It's difficult. Your distance from target could be low, could be super high. A fogger in the corner of a Quonset hut is pretty far from the target, or you might be there with a gun. Potential for operator exposure, well, if you're in a closed environment with spray, it could be pretty high unless you set this thing and run out. But you have no concern about drift. In fact, drift is your buddy in most of these cases. So look at the variability and recognize that if you do get sprayer advice, and if you forget everything about this talk except this, ask who that person was that gave it to you and what world they're from. Okay, so that's all context. Let's get into some nitty gritty. Droplet size and coverage potential, another horrid graph or table. I don't often do this, but this is, again, context, and it's fun to me, so you're going to pretend it's fun too. These are the ratings of particle diameter in the left-hand column. These are the size of the diameter of a droplet. In the next column, we have comparison. This gives you some frame of reference in the real world. So what I want you to take away from this is how different these droplets behave. Droplets that are 5 to 40 microns, and you're very likely to use these in misters and foggers, take about, 1,000 seconds to fall out of the air in calm conditions. If there were even the faintest breeze, 5 kilometers an hour isn't a lot. They could go kilometers sideways before they ever fall, if they ever fall. What's neat is, as the droplets get smaller, the number of droplets go way up. It's a cubic relationship, which means every time a droplet is cut in half, you have the potential volume for 8 more droplets. So you can imagine how that exponentially multiplies. But the price, of course, is evaporation. Something that's the size of a mote of dust doesn't have a lot of water in it, which means by the time it gets anywhere in a dry condition, it just evaporates into a mote. Now, because your world is a little more diverse, you could spray up to 200 micron droplets or bigger. So to the far right, you kind of see you are here. And I have to provide this much information because you need to figure out where you fall on this spectrum, depending on what kind of spraying you use, because your limitations and your potential for success changes depending on who you are. What's really neat, and the reason I have 3 of these rows in green, is because outside of a greenhouse where it's contained and generally pretty humid, there's no survivability of such tiny droplets. Like, they turn into nothing long before they get anywhere. But in your world, we can really leverage the high number of droplets and trust in the fact that even if they're teeny weeny, humidity will keep them alive long enough to do what they need to do. So let's dig a little into that. There are two methods to increase the contact level between a droplet and the surface we're trying to protect or control or introduce a product to. So we start by looking at a droplet, and if a droplet lands on a surface, it's got high surface tension, which means it forms a kind of a bubble. But the area that it covers, it does spread out a bit. That's called a spread factor. So a 200 micron droplet, which is a medium-sized droplet, has the potential to spread about 2x, twice of its diameter. So one way to improve the amount of coverage is to use a surfactant. Just think of it as adding an oil or something like that. That's not always correct. But the point is it drops the surface tension and causes the droplet to spread out. So suddenly this droplet with a 2 times spread factor with the right adjuvant could suddenly cover 10 times the surface area just because it's more runny. And that's quite a thing that we can leverage. It's not always the safest thing to do because it can affect phytotoxicity. If it makes the liquid runnier, if I can use the word, there's also the potential to make the surface of the crop looser and introduce far more product than that plant was ever meant to receive in testing. And it can cause negative effects. Also, when the water gets looser and runnier, it gets looser and runnier and tends to come off vertical surfaces. So hard to wet things like fruit, tomatoes are terribly difficult to keep spray on, for example, or any kind of vertical leaf, something grassy. It's just going to go on a wild carpet ride and slide right off. This is, if you don't recognize it, an almond in the hull off a tree. I had the privilege and honor to go to Australia a few years back before our world got turned inside out. And I'd never seen almond production. I learned so much from that trip. This was a demo that we did demonstrating the power of spread and adjuvants. Those water droplets that are beaded up on that fuzzy surface are just water. But the blue has had a tiny amount of organosilicone, an adjuvant added to it. And you can see the stain. I think I got ahead of my script here. You can see the stain as that single drop just spreads and covers so much of that fuzzy, hard to wet nut. So an interesting approach to improving coverage is chemical spread. Let's go back to our diagram here. There's another way to improve coverage, and this is within your reach because your greenhouse operators are closed environment sprayers, and that's the mechanical spread that I alluded to. If you took that same volume, that 200 micron droplet, and cut it up, a 200 micron droplet could make 64 50 medium micron droplets. That again doubles the spread factor because you've got so many of them working for you. That volume can cover so much more surface area. In fact, let's go crazy. The math at the very, very bottom, if we were to use 10 micron droplets, effectively a fog, you would cover 5 times the area. Well, that's a 1,916% or 20-fold increase in coverage. So, you should be rubbing your hands here. This is a great way to improve all around coverage. If only you could get them to go where you want them to go and survive the trip. So here's some of those considerations. Why wouldn't you just carve these droplets up as tiny as you could? Well, there's a benefit. There's no runoff. Tiny droplets, if they land, they're not going anywhere. And that's great because if we get things too wet in a greenhouse, it could lead to botrytis, mildew, other things we don't want. They're super duper for the biorational products. And we're getting better organic products all the time, but a lot of them maybe don't have the same efficacy as the manufactured products. As such, coverage becomes critical. And a great way to get spray to penetrate dense canopies is to go with finer droplets. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, there's the other side of the teeter-totter. Tiny droplets don't tend to like to go anywhere, and we'll talk about that too. We need some way to encourage them to get to the target. And any crops that have trichomes or hairs, think cucumber, think tomato, they tend to get hung up on the trichomes. And you'll see it look like a misty, foggy deposit. I've got microscopy pictures of a trichome, And the droplet at the very top, where a little bug can just walk right underneath and never come in contact with the product that was supposed to land on the surface, which is a little disheartening, but adjuvants can help there. Now, I'm just going to show you a different way to think about that. And this work came from Alison McGregor out of Australia. She did this with grapes. And we just wanted to look at how difficult it would be to cover, say, a fruit. Fruit is notoriously hard to spray versus a laminar surface like a leaf. So I just sort of extrapolated her grape work to a tomato. On the left, we've got an adjuvant in spray. And what they found was when you sprayed the surface, some of it ran off, as I suggested, but because it changes surface tension, they also saw the liquid kind of creep right back up the outside of the surface, forming a nice even distribution of that spray, or that dose, if you want to think it that way. If you use a coarser spray, big splattery droplets, you tend to get non-uniform coverage. And that means they run to the bottom of any vertical target and form drip points way at the bottom. And with drip points, you have the potential for, say, something like blossom end rot, or you have the potential for higher MRLs, residue levels at the bottom of the target, where all the product tend to hang up and then evaporate right into place, raising the concentration. Not a great way to go. But the finer spray, when they did the research, was actually the best of all three, because it covered the surface more consistently. It didn't relocate, so it didn't roll around on there. It stayed where it was supposed to go. And they ended up ultimately getting a higher dose of product on the outside and a more consistent dose all at the same time. So yay fines, something I never get to say outside a closed environment. Now, let's just talk a little bit about the nozzles you might be using. I'm trying to watch the clock here. I could definitely go over if I'm not careful. Spray quality, which is droplet size, is actually a spectrum. For most forms of application, if you buy a nozzle and that nozzle says, I make a medium droplet, not necessarily. In fact, most of the droplets that come out would be a medium or a certain size, but it's a bell curve. So volumetrically, some of the volume coming out of the nozzle is made up of smaller droplets and some is larger, and it's fairly normal. So you get most of these droplets of a certain size in the middle, and then some sort of outliers, some small, some big. Now, we use terms for this. We'll say VMD, or volume median diameter. All that really means is if I took all the liquid that came out of a nozzle and I could sort it out by the droplet sizes, most of the volume would be comprised of these medium-sized droplets if it were a medium nozzle. And as I said, the outliers. But the dirty little lie in that is we really shouldn't look at the volume coming out of a nozzle when we make that decision. We should look at the count. We know that if you cut a droplet in half, size-wise, you have the potential for 8 droplets. So instead of sorting it by volume on that bell curve, let's throw them on a histogram and sort them by droplet size. Let's say we could physically sort all the droplets and count them up. What would that look like? Well, this is a piece of water-sensitive paper that I sprayed with a hollow cone nozzle. Then I have software that will do counts and guess its sizes. And I say guess, it's another conversation. And you can see that its VMD, or its average, is 390 microns. I don't know if you can see my mouse. So that's right here. So you would buy that nozzle and think, okay, most of what I'm putting out is a 390 micron droplet. Brilliant, that's a really big droplet. But the numerical average is way down here. Look at how many phenomenally small droplets there are in a nozzle that is said to produce a very large average. No matter what you do, you're going to produce a huge population of these tiny droplets. Turns out that's a good thing in all situations because of how big and little droplets behave. We like heterogeneity. We like bigs and littles. They kind of work for us. Now let's take this right down. This is another context slide. I wish I could see past this bar at the top of the screen. I did this for apple. This is all to scale. That's an ascospore. So this is for apple scab. And it's about 15 microns from the germ tube all the way to the tip. In other words, one tiny little sucker. And it doesn't move around. It stays where it lands. We need to bring the spray to it. If we sprayed a 50 micron leaf area, that's tiny. And we sprayed it with 50 micron droplets, that is pretty much the kind of coverage we could expect. That droplet would more or less fill that square, and the odds of physically contacting that spore are really, really good. In fact, if you spray 250 liters per hectare like this, you could evenly cover one drop every 2,500 micron. You're going to blanket all the surface area. Now, this is a fairly simplistic way to put it. I'm making a lot of assumptions, and I don't intend you to read all this, but I'll just say we're assuming all the droplets get there. We're assuming they don't land on top of each other, that they spread nice and evenly, but we're also assuming they don't spread at all. And every droplet will spread when it lands, so some of that might cancel itself out. We're also assuming that when the droplet hits, its effective radius, or the area in which it actually affects biology, is limited to where the stain is. That's not true. Droplets have a kind of halo of influence, a little bit of creep, where you can expect some biological activity a little further away from the droplet, even if it's a contact product. So all that to say, a fairly modest volume broken up into tiny droplets, you can't miss. And if that scale doesn't tickle you, we can look at a mullein bug, another apple pest, which is why I did this. So this is a much bigger leaf. I couldn't even draw a scale square to show you what we were just looking at. But in this case, we're 2,500 microns per side. That's how big the mullein bug is. And if we used 200 micron droplets instead of 50s, this is what the distribution could look like. Again, contact or systemic, this bug hasn't got a chance. This is a minefield. That's 37 drops every 2,500 micron square surface. It's just going to pepper the surface, making all those same assumptions. So again, I'm trying to give you some context between volumes, droplet size, and potential coverage. So let's step away from that and talk about some of the things you can control: pressure, flow, and your spray quality. I see this all the time in greenhouses that have a central pumping house. You use phenomenal pressure, hundreds and hundreds of pounds per square inch, because you got to force that liquid through a lot of lines all the way out to where you need access in the greenhouse bays. Unfortunately, when the pressure kind of gets to that point, it's still probably way, way, way too high. And I don't know why we don't regulate that better. But let me show you what pressure does to spray quality. On our left, if we have an 1102 nozzle, so 110 degree flat fan that puts out 0.2 gallons per minute at 40 PSI, it's going to form a kind of a narrow spray. It's going to put out so much liquid, and it's going to make coarser droplets. And all that comes to bear on this picture of water-sensitive paper at the bottom, which we'll also talk to a little later. Great way to diagnose what you're doing. That very same nozzle, and we crank the pressure up, look at what happens. More flow comes out, the angle of the fan gets wider, the droplets get finer, and you get more of them, and look at the water-sensitive paper. So you as an operator, just by adjusting pressure, have control over your rate and droplet size. And if you didn't know that before, this may be something you can adjust to adjust the spray quality in your operation if you have that capacity. Am I really going to do inverse square relationship with you? Let's just go with this. The further away a droplet has to go from the nozzle to the target, the less energy it has. And we see this in life all the time. If you double the distance between a nozzle and a target, you don't have the energy. It's an inverse square relationship. So what that means is if you were to crank your pressure up 4 times in an effort to make droplets smaller, you would only get you'd only double the flow. Pressure and flow don't match 1-to-1. So if you're already thinking, oh, I'll crank my pressure and make my droplets smaller and increase my flow, it's diminishing return. You can only tweak that so much. Also, if droplets have a certain amount of energy when they leave the nozzle, that quickly burns off depending how far they need to go until they're eventually immobile. And we're going to get into that as well. So just to go back, if you want to use your pressure to adjust flow, recognize it takes an awful lot of it to make big changes. It's often better just to change to a nozzle that natively produces the flow and spray you like. So how you putting this stuff on? And this is where everyone does everything so differently. Most of the high volume applications use a tree or a vertical boom like this. They may also use a horizontal boom. For you guys, it's highly variable. maybe 40 liters of liquid comes out per minute, and your volume median diameter, your average droplet size might be 150 microns. If you're using this system, you got to watch out for runoff. It's very likely to cause everything to drip and run. So for people using this system, you've got to be pretty close to the target, and you have to recognize that you're risking the spray redistributing and pouring off your target. Another high volume system, this is a targeted system, is like the Dram Hydro Sprayer. You're actually using a gun. And I've been to some startup greenhouses that have used things like pressure washers, which I don't recommend for spraying plants unless you're looking to strip the leaves off at the same time that you spray. In this case, you're spraying up to 3.75 liters a minute. You're generally using a larger droplet, and this is definitely something that's going to incur runoff. So unless you're trying to drench a target or spray a very far away and you don't mind a little runoff, maybe this is or isn't the system for you. You can also use a similar but low volume targeted system that might do a little better. Imagine this one is spraying a much finer droplet, and which by design also much less liquid. This would be where you're using a slightly higher concentration of product. You're not using water so much to distribute the pesticide or the product. You're using pressure from the sprayer to fling a more concentrated product further, and then hopefully get it to stick when it arrives. And at 30 to 60 microns, that's pretty small and very likely. And a good example is the cold fogger. And then we get into the real small stuff. You can do slow or fast fogs. These can be stationary or handheld systems. These are tremendously low volume systems, so you're almost spraying product neat. And this is where sometimes labels can let us down. If we want to apply a product using this system, but it's not recognized on the label, I'm afraid you can't do it. There are usually very good reasons for why you can't do it. It may react in unexpected ways with the plant we're trying to protect. It may escape the greenhouse in ways we don't want, but quite often it's because no one's done the research to determine where those new limits should be. But I've heard a lot of great stories about equipment manufacturers working with registrants, the people that sell the chemistry, to try to establish those and have labels expanded to include these methods. So if you're ever considering using a fogging system for a product that says nothing about using a fogging system, obviously if it says don't fog, you're out of luck. But if it doesn't say anything, you might want to reach out to Fadi or Andrew or one of the specialists or the registrant or the equipment manufacturer to find out if it's permitted or not, and what might be done to expand the label or include it. I threw this in just for completeness because I knew you would have this talk long after I'm gone, and sometimes I like to draw. I've just never seen a really clear indication of how to calculate the volume, so I thought I'd do it myself. And what I've got here is the three common situations: Quonset greenhouses, ridge and furrow, and gutter connected. And I've color-coded the formulas so you can see which parts of the formulas calculate which part of the closed environment. And then you can assemble this to figure out what kind of volume you're actually using for misting and fogging. So, we're not going to belabor it, but I just wanted to be in here in case you ever want to go back and review it. Air circulation and drift. Wow, I alluded to this at the beginning. It feels dirty and wrong, but I get to tell you that drift is your friend. There is not another agricultural setting where I can say that without feeling terrible about myself. But in your case, drift is fabulous, because drift will carry those tremendously small droplets everywhere you want them to go. In fact, stationary foggers rely on the air circulation in your closed environment, not necessarily the air being produced by the fogger, but where those droplets go after it's run out of energy, that inverse square law again. But if you have too much air, and this is beyond anything I know a lot about, I happen to know that it causes plants to suffer a bit. They bonsai, or they tend to be stunted, like a little white pine clinging to the edge of a cliff. If your air is moving too slow, that spray is not going to go anywhere. It's just going to hang in the air like a cloud. So sometimes it behooves you to kind of step away from the sprayer when analyzing your coverage, and get yourself an air meter, either some little handheld rig or an anemometer that's hot wire, and try to figure out where the air currents are in your greenhouse, because where the air goes, these tremendously fine droplets will follow. if you're not using those super fine droplets, you can still take advantage of using air to carry droplets. It's an air assist system. And as an air blast guy, I'm biased, but it's very powerful stuff. If you're attempting to spray simply using hydraulic pressure and you're not happy with your coverage, using air-based systems and smaller droplets can really come to the rescue. Just a public service announcement, and I like the word, to avoid spray drenching. This is just, even if you have the right equipment and the right spray quality, you can trip at the finish line by standing too close to a target or inadvertently focusing the spray in one spot. If you were to aim the spray down, like the top of this image, the very dark pink triangle, you're going to end up with a highly concentrated, very energetic drench in one spot. Whereas if you're good about rhythmically moving back and forth and spraying slightly over the target, you're going to distribute the spray more effectively, more uniformly, which is what we're looking for. And I've been told that there are lots of tricks to doing this. It seems colossally dangerous to be walking backwards as you're waving a wand back and forth, but you can pace yourself using everything from good music to just watching the infrastructure in the greenhouse and knowing how long it should take to pass, say, posts. Know your output rate and check it out. So you walk backwards, side to side with a level arc. Avoid going up and down. Just stay consistent. If penetration of a dense canopy is your difficulty, is your challenge, sometimes if you can't use air assist and you can't use fine droplets, you're kind of in trouble, because a droplet is going to simply land on the first thing it comes in contact with. And if that's the outside of a dense canopy, then its trip is over. But sometimes, if the pesticide label permits multiple applications, you can use time to penetrate a canopy. So the 3 circles on the left show how multiple lower dose sprays, if there's a limit on the amount of product. And again, I'll leave this to Andrew and Fadi to shake their head and say, nope, don't ever do this with some products. But if you spray and then the crop grows, a certain amount of residual is left behind. Now, admittedly, not as active as perhaps it was a week before, but still there. And as the crop grows and layers, you're sort of embedding product. And that's far better than what's on the right, which is like one wild attempt to drench a canopy. It just won't go in as far. And you can see this with water-sensitive paper, which again, we'll get to. Transfer efficiency, this is just a bit more about droplet behavior. And I labored with whether I should introduce this at the beginning or at the end, but as long as I've said it, we're going to use a metaphor. Just imagine that a big, coarse droplet is a golf ball, something heavy, something that has a lot of mass. And a finer droplet is more like a ping pong ball or even a feather. And just imagine you've got them in your hand and you throw them lightly. The amount of force you used is the pressure. And pressure will affect droplets differently depending on their size. So what do you think would happen if you had both of these balls in your hand? Yeah, I said it. And you threw these with light pressure. This is what would happen. And I've done this outside many times. It's a great example for people. The golf ball is going to go a lot further because it moves ballistically. It's going to travel further because of its mass. It's going to fight gravity, and drag isn't going to do so much. But the fine golf ball, the finer droplet, the ping pong ball, who knows where it's going to go? A good gust of wind, it might even land behind you. So maybe we should crank up the pressure, try to drive them further. What do you think would happen then? This is what happens. You never see the golf ball again, and you probably end up breaking one of the glass panes in your greenhouse. But the finer droplet, if it does go any further, it's not going to be a heck of a lot. Real diminishing return on pressure when it comes to motivating droplets to move. In fact, if you remember earlier, we said if you crank the pressure up, droplets get smaller. So you may even be defeating the purpose. Unless you're using a coarser droplet, don't bother using pressure to try to get droplets to go further. With fines, they need air or some other mechanism to carry them. This is just one more kind of hammer at home lesson. This is from using air blast sprayers and backpack mist blowers in peach trees. So these water sensitive papers, this is what you're looking at, are bright yellow until they're contacted by liquid, then they turn blue. And they're a super way of figuring out where spray went or where it didn't go. On your left, This paper was placed 3 feet deep into a fully mature peach canopy. And we used pretty big droplets on this air blast sprayer. You can see that they've splattered, and we have that heterogeneity I talked about, some big ones and some little ones. And then using a backpack mist blower, which uses a much more focused blast of air and finer droplets, the paper located in the exact same position, spraying the same amount of volume. Look at that. Look what we did just by aiming the air a little better and using a slightly finer droplet. In fact, that last paper is a paper located 10 feet up on the peach canopy. So the spray had to go through the canopy to even reach this thing. And this shows how well fine droplets can circumnavigate complex canopies and whip around corners and change direction. So if you've never considered using a mist blower in your operation, you might consider it. There are some limitations. I'm not sure what we have in the way of electric mist blowers. They don't tend to blow very far. And the gas-powered ones, which I prefer, may not be feasible unless you're wearing ventilation equipment. We did some work years ago. I can't remember when this was, but it was fairly telling that by choosing nozzles with different shapes, you can have different impacts. So when we spray, we just picture this cloud of mist. And for some sprayers, that's true. But for hydraulic sprayers where you can pick different nozzles, you also have the option to change the shape that the spray comes out. So these water-sensitive papers in the columns were a dual flat fan, which is like 2 little fans parallel to one another. In the middle is a hollow cone, which, yay, sprays in a hollow cone, and then a single flat fan. And this was in tomato. We placed the papers upside down, that is sensitive side facing the ground. We hid them behind fruit, and we even placed them sideways so their thin edge was facing the spray. In other words, we made the targets as darn hard as we could. The dual flat fan in a single pass drenched all 3 targets. The hollow cone, that's the cumulative coverage from 4 passes. And while it did surprisingly good behind the fruit, although you can see a bit of a shadow, it didn't do a whole lot in either other sort of circumstance. And that's because there was no air behind it. The fines were just sort of released into the environment and they just didn't go anywhere. And the flat fan, it did okay, but it only had one angle of attack, which is to say it lands on the first thing it comes in contact with. And since it's only one plane, you kind of get one crack at it. So this led us to think that on a tree or a vertical boom, dual flat fans in hanging crops, tomato, perhaps cucumber, we didn't look, may have some advantage. So it might be worth you trying that out. And finally, evaluating coverage. I keep promoting water-sensitive paper, but it's such a tremendous tool because you no longer have to guess. You don't have to look at spray swaths. You don't have to wait to see if disease grabs your crop. You can find out really quickly where your spray went. And I recommend you getting a bag of these and just being creative. Fold them, spindle them, stab them onto things, hide them in your crop, make a mess of them. Put them where you want to know if your spray went. Put them where the pest is giving you grief. And we did this many, many times. This is using a handheld pulse fog. And this was better coverage than I anticipated, but it just gives an example of how you might place them and what you can look at. I did say that a mix of droplet sizes can be desirable because they behave differently, so they offer different advantages. But a few warnings about water-sensitive paper. Anything under 30 microns, I'm talking to the foggers and misters, you're not going to be able to count the drops. You're just going to see the paper slowly turn a uniform shade of blue-green. It's kind of unfair to use these systems with misters and foggers because I don't think they do them justice. For them, we've done work with UV indicators and stuff just to kind of wander the greenhouse later and try to find bits of fluorescent color. But, that's not something I get to do very much because I don't necessarily have the MSDS or the safety sheets on the fluorescent dyes. I am working with something made by Crayola right now that's supposed to be perfectly safe to put on your face. So maybe that's a solution. We'll see what we do in the future. If you buy this stuff, you get it in a foil pack. Just hold it by the edges or wear gloves or our sweaty, greasy fingers will cause them to react. If you want to do a real trial, it's best to place them out with a number written on the back so you know later where they came from and what you did. And then you make one change to your spray program, replace the paper, do it again, and compare them. So it's iterative. Check, make a change, check. try to be fair, put them in the same place when you take them out and put them back. So it's a legit comparison. I normally say avoid high humidity and dew, but for you guys in humid greenhouses, the clock's running the moment you put them out. Don't collect them until dry. Again, maybe not an option you have, but you can remove them from the greenhouse, bring them out into the hall, maybe where it's drier, not so warm. Don't touch them until they've had a chance to dry, or you're just going to smear them. Also, if you want to collect them to look at them later, I don't recommend Ziploc bags. By the time you open them, they're just all going to be blue. I've used paper. That works pretty well. And if you have it dry and you want to keep a record, maybe a spray record for some reason, I found that just dropping a slice of packing tape over the surface keeps them for a long time. So we've made it to the end. I'm just going to let you know again some resources for you to explore. This is my counterpart, Dr. Tom Wolf. And as I said, we'll do pretty much anything to teach and train, including throwing vile green liquids at each other. So Exploding Sprayer Myths is a series you might explore. Even though at the beginning of this talk, I said, beware the context of the information. You may think some of this is specifically for field croppers, but now that you know the differences, there's information in here that would be of value to you, even if it isn't directly aimed at your situation. Micron Woman is a project we did a little while ago. It's a comic book. My career is now complete. I have a comic book. But what we wanted to do was teach the context of droplet behavior from the droplet's perspective. And since I can't shrink you all down to 10 microns, we found a superhero that could. So there's a video that goes with this and the actual comic book itself. And if you're interested, there's good content in there despite the format. You may enjoy it. And lastly, I mentioned I spend a lot of time with air blast sprayers. I spent a lot of lockdown writing this book with a colleague out of Michigan with content from an associate in New Zealand. And it is 300 pages of fully illustrated physics of droplet behavior. And before you throw up in the back of your mouth a bit, we tried to make it as accessible and interesting and illustrated as we could. And I guarantee there's good information in there that can help inform your spray program. And it's perfectly free. Unless you get the paper copy, then it's just print on demand. And I've got the link right there. Your kind hosts to droplet behavior are Turbulent Eddy and Laminar Flow. Yes, I think I'm funny. And finally, all of this can be resourced through sprayers101.com. It's got a really robust search engine, so you can just go there and type in a couple of keywords of something you're interested in, and that may be a quick and easy way for you to find articles, calculators, videos. We do pretty much everything on that website, and there are greenhouse articles in there. If you ever want to reach out to me, you can find me through OMAFRA, of course, or if you'd prefer to tweet, Tom and I are pretty active on Twitter. So that's it from me. I think I held it to 45 minutes, and I'll stop sharing my screen and take a deep breath.
Thanks a lot, Jason. That was a lot of great information for everybody in the audience today. So we do have a question in the Q&A, and maybe we'll answer that live. I'll let Andrew ask the Q&A questions, but I do want to let everybody know that this is a smaller group, so which is great because we could be a little bit more personal. So if people want to just ask their question or have a conversation, they can raise their digital hand, and I'll unmute you, and you can ask your question in person. Or if you feel more comfortable, just put your questions in the Q&A as we already have one in there, and we'll ask the question. Yeah, so Andrew, you want to get going with the questions?
So Jason's answered that was a comment about Rita was saying that she enjoyed the presentation.
That's a question I can answer.
That's the only, that was the only thing in the Q&A. So anybody who has a question, feel free to drop a question in the Q&A.
Come on, Lou. I want you to ask a question like, what happened to the project we were working on?
I think, so Chris here has a question. So I'm going to unmute your mic. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Yeah, you just want to introduce yourself, just your name and where you work before you ask your question.
Sure. Yeah, Chris Deveau Schoff with the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association in Guelph. Thank you, Jason, for that presentation. I think it's the first one that of quite a few that I've seen of your presentations where you've talked about drift being a good thing. So that was kind of interesting.
My mouth
most
feels
of the
so
time,
bad saying
like,
that.
pictures of air blast sprayers with these huge plumes of drift, and you're going, no, no, no. So that was a nice little change there. On that though, there, of course, ventilation. You know, there is ventilation in greenhouses, and is it possible that that would ever enter into that scenario on thinking about drift, and like some of the labels in particular, like, would have a restriction even that hold ventilation or whatever if it's like a fog or super low, super fine type of application. I'm just wondering if you come across anything like that where drift inside a greenhouse could be a thing if it was small enough and ventilation was open. I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. And it was one of the first questions that I asked our 3 iterations of greenhouse specialists ago, guys. So one of the first greenhouses I went into, I saw the fogger and I said, well, how does this work? You know, you close all the vents. Oh yeah, we close it. It's just like fogging a house for bugs. Like, it's a completely sealed environment. And I said, well, when do you open them again? And what do you do with, we'll say, contaminated air? Contaminated may not be the right word, but air that still contains buoyant droplets. And the answer that I got, and you saw the numbers in my table, was that after a certain period of time, with sufficient circulation, eventually all these droplets will come to roost somewhere. They're no longer buoyant. They're no longer in the air. They will eventually land. If it were completely calm and you left it for even 10 hours, I would have concerns that some of it might still be floating around out there. But even with modest circulation, eventually it tends to ground and those tiny droplets will fix. So if you opened a closed environment too soon and ventilated it, yep, you would be pushing air that was impregnated with droplets out into the environment. But that's also why the labels will say, keep it closed for this long, or don't ventilate this room, give everything an opportunity to light. And if those rules are followed, that in tandem with the volume of the space you're working in, all that's been tested ostensibly.
Yeah, and also just that led into another thought about re-entry intervals, because that would be based on assuming that at a certain point of time, that air would be clean of droplets, right? It would have to settle out. So another thing, I guess, to just beware is the re-entry intervals, and obviously the finer the droplets, the potential to have them in the air for longer, right?
Absolutely. And that's why at the beginning of the talk, I had the risk of operator exposure relative to other environments is higher, only for that reason. But of course, we do respect these chemistries. We do respect restricted entry or re-entry intervals, which I've been told isn't the right word, restricted entry. And the use of ventilators and personal protective equipment when you're in that closed environment and not just setting a fogger and buggering off. We have to respect that and should.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jason.
Thanks for your question. Good to hear from you. Rita's got a question that she put in the Q&A, so I'll read it out for the benefit of anybody that's not reading through those. She's assuming that the same droplet behavior is what we've been hearing about with the spread of COVID. And she's asking, are there any new findings from all of the medical research that's being done currently that's further informing any of this science that you presented today?
I am 100% uncomfortable and unqualified to talk about the transfer of contagions, particularly COVID. And I can actually see that my manager is on the call. So rest assured, Joanne, I have no comment on that. But from a purely technical and physical standpoint, tiny droplets are tiny droplets. And everything I informed you of here on how very fine droplets move and survive or don't survive, and how they are propelled or aren't propelled is entirely transferable. But there's so much more to it than that. It's not just a matter of a droplet arriving, but how many of them there are and what's actually in them, and how virulent or sensitive the target is if and when they land. So I've personally never crossed that line. My father used to be an air traffic controller, and his famous line, I remember being old enough to ask him, how do you tolerate being in charge of massive boxes of metal full of lives flying through the air? And he said, you can't look at it that way. Just never let the green triangles touch. And I thought, that is some sage advice. So I'm teaching you how these droplets move and behave, and it's for you to decide how many need to get there, what the dose needs to be to kind of fit those rules to your situation. Prescribing a specific situation means that 90% of the people listening here, it wouldn't be relevant to them. So I found I've had the most impact by laying the rules out and then letting you find the situation that best works for you. I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's just, it seems to be more effective for people just to understand the rules.
Okay, I've got a quick question, since there's not any in the Q&A, any additional ones yet.
Andrew, we have Hassan with his hand up. If I could just take his question first.
Sure.
Thanks. Hassan, I'll get you to unmute and introduce yourself before asking a question.
You put Hassan on the spot.
Can't hear you. Okay, maybe trying to figure.
Oh, it looks like his mic's not working. Do you want to type your question then, Hassan?
Yeah, why don't you type your question? And in the meantime, Andrew, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Jason, you kind of led into this, and you said that we might have some questions about your time-based approach to control. So I assume that you've had this question before. So when you were talking about having multiple sprays, leaving some residual product in place to have some sort of effect.
Yeah.
From the perspective of resistance management, we usually want to have one inundative treatment that takes care of the population, the same way that you wouldn't want to be taking subclinical doses of antibiotics, on a constant basis. You really want that inundative shock. So, yeah, what would you say about that as opposed to one drench?
I'd say you're absolutely right, Andrew. A lot of what we do in spraying is trying to find the lesser of two evils. So I'll give you a great example. If somebody wants to go spray early in the morning outside because they're spraying an insecticide and they're concerned that they don't want to hit pollinators, and that's a very valid concern. You can look at that situation and go, if you spray that early in the morning, you could be in a temperature inversion, which means your spray will remain suspended, which means it has the potential to drift for kilometers, and you could inadvertently cause more damage to a pollinator in any direction than you would have if you had sprayed a few dead on. And that's an ugly conversation because, it's not great either way. Likewise, with resistant discussions, if we just tickle a pest, we do have the potential to incur selection for resistance. At the same time, it kind of depends on the nature of the pest. It depends on the nature of the product. Is this a disease that's going to replicate quickly and we select for the stronger strain? Maybe. Is it an insect that's kind of in there and dead is dead because it's such a high dose, even if there's enough residual? Maybe. I listed it simply as a strategy to get the product to a target. But you're absolutely right. There are more concerns. And that's why I advised that someone talk to you or Fadi or the registrant or someone that knows how the product works before they say do multiple sprays at a lower dose so that they don't exceed a maximum residue limit or the number of applications in a certain period of time. It's just one possible strategy for certain situations. It's not something to be blanket applied without thought. None of this is.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that thoughtful answer. Let's see if Hassan, I don't see a question in the Q&A, but perhaps the microphone has started working. We can get his question.
I think we're running out of time here, guys. So I think I'm gonna wrap it up just to be aware of everybody's time. And Hassan, if your question, please email it to myself or.
No, it came up. Maybe we can hit it quick.
All right, let's do that.
Hassan says, if I understand correctly, you're saying that to get better coverage, let's say on a mature cucumber crop with a very large downward pointing leaf, it'd be the best thing to have very small droplets rather than using extremely high volume that would agitate the leaves. I've been concerned we're using too much volume and the plants are wet and dripping on the floor. Okay, Hassan, absolutely true. There are two ways to move a canopy out of the way so spray can penetrate. One is using air, which is my preference, and the other is to blast the heck out of it with liquid, which also works at exposing other parts of the canopy at the cost of a very inefficient and water-heavy application. You do not need to drench a target unless the product is intended to drench a target. And so few of them actually are. It's far better to get a nice, even distribution of spray in smaller droplets. If this is an approach you would like to explore, I highly recommend you do so with an air assist component. If that's not possible, if you just want to maybe back off your volume on a vertical boom, you can attempt to use a finer spray and slow the equipment down a little bit. In doing so, you actually create a situation where you might permit the spray to go a little further and not get caught up in the turbulent wake behind the equipment. I'm not 100% sure, but before anyone does any of these experiments, or if you leave here enthused and you want to try new things, please use the water sensitive paper. Establish the situation that you have now, and then make a single change and see what effect that had. And Andrew wants a piece of this. I think would like to answer this question live.
Oh, no, that was just on there from.
Oh, okay. So I hope that helps. I think approaching a zero runoff situation means all your product stays where it's meant to be, and you can do so without increasing the humidity of the greenhouse itself, which is also good.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of the webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks Jason for the great talk. If anybody has any follow-up questions, please get in touch with any of the panelists here, and we'll be happy to point you in the right direction. All right, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
I'll see you next time.